Voice of San Diego podcasts are sponsored by the Bob Nelson Charitable Fund, honoring the San Diego Harbor Police Foundation.
Welcome to the Voice of San Diego podcast in partnership with News Radio 600 Coco. My name is Scott Lewis. I'm the CEO and editor-in-chief of Voice of San Diego, and joined as always by assistant editor Andrew Cate.
Hey, Scott, how are we?
I'm pretty good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And managing editor Sarah Libby.
Hello.
Hi, how are you, Sarah?
I'm also doing fine.
I'm coming at you from Ocean Beach, which has been a little bit stinky recently. I was trying to get my kids to help me come up with descriptors of what it smells like for use on the television, and my son came up with bat barf, which I think is probably the winner so far.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. I've never
got a coronavirus tie-in.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a real contextual one. I think it smells like a paper mill like I used to live next to in South Carolina. A little like rotting trash mixed with something sweet. It has like a sweet tincture to it. It's gross.
You know, moving to San Diego didn't really prepare me for the number of beach smell stories there would be. There have been several over the years, which is not a genre that I knew I would be covering.
It was one of your first big stories as an editor at Voice of San Diego.
It really was, yeah.
Oh, that's right, La Jolla.
La Jolla stench.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our Mackenzie Elmer, environment reporter, she went and found out that the algal bloom, which creates the beautiful bioluminescence at night, that has died off and is decomposing, and that is what's causing the smell. So,
it smells great in Golden Hill. It's not a problem. Haven't caught a whiff of it.
We've got a great show this week. We've got Councilman Cate coming in to talk about how the city is grappling with the money they got for COVID relief and what they can and cannot spend it on. And remember SDSU West? 2 years ago, San Diego voters said the city should sell that old Mission Valley Stadium land to SDSU. They're at the beginning of the end of that entire redevelopment, I think. We will explain exactly where that deal stands. And speaking of money, smaller cities really want it. Some of them don't qualify for federal monies, so they're looking to the county for help. And we're talking about reopening, so in my opinion, we have to talk about schools. We're going to banter about that a little bit. So first up, this SDSU West issue. Let's just explain they have to actually make this deal, and the city is really interested at this moment in getting that deal done for two reasons. One, they want the money, and two, they want to not lose money. And that all comes because they have to spend about $1 million a month to maintain and operate Qualcomm, or the former Qualcomm Stadium, SDCCU Stadium, and they have to, and they don't want to do that. And that budget for next year has to be finalized in July. And they want the money from the actual sale of the land to come in. And so when you do the scheduling backwards from July, they come to May 19th as the day that the city council needs to go ahead and give final approval to the purchase and sale agreement, which means right now there's some fighting going on about the terms of that gigantic purchase and sale agreement, which was finally made public this week.
Yeah, and I think it was kind of steadily marching in the background towards this point. And from what I could tell, there wasn't a lot of outward appearances that things were going wrong. I admit I haven't been following this too closely, so maybe it was already clear behind the scenes that things were ugly. But it really erupted last week. First, when Maura Elliott issued a memo outlining considerable problems she saw in the purchase and sale agreement that the university had put together. And it was her memo didn't just highlight problems with that purchase and sale agreement, but pretty specifically described the university itself as not negotiating in good faith and not holding to certain timelines and needing to be dragged kicking and screaming to the point that they were at.
I think it's important to clarify there's actually like 3 or maybe even 4 parties to this situation. There's the university, which is pretty united with the CSU system. Then there's the city, which is led by Chris Michelle, the chief operating officer, on behalf of Mayor Kevin Faulconer. And then there's the city attorney, which is, as we all know, an independent office. And that's who brought up these concerns you're talking about, City Attorney Mara Elliott. And then there's the 4th party, which is the City Council. So the city has 3 different major entities discussing this, and the university has 1, and is kind of playing them off each other.
Yeah, that was my take. So after Mara Elliott's memo last week really disrupted things, I spoke to Jack McGorry for the politics report, who had some very explosive quotes about the process with the city, and specifically City Attorney Mara Elliott's disposition towards getting the deal done.
Let's explain who he is real quick.
So go ahead.
He's the former city manager of the city of San Diego, went on to become a developer and a successful business guy, and now is a member of the CSU Board of Trustees, and was obviously one of the architects behind this entire initiative to get it passed. So, a big player on SDSU's team. And he basically said, she's hated this deal for a long time. She's just trying to scuttle it.
Yeah, and I think to your point about playing entities off each other, really decided, rather than respond point by point to the issues that Elliott raised in the memo, he was just going to get out of that ball game and instead put the issue into the laps of the city council and say, hey, city council, this is ultimately your decision. You get to vote to approve this deal or not. And it's time for you to decide whether you want the deal or you, because we're done going point by point with Mara Elliott for all this time. I don't know. What did you think about that, Sarah?
I don't know. I have a hard time kind of wrapping my mind around this, because I think we would be talking about it a lot differently if we weren't talking about a public university, and that, given the bad deals that the city has been locked into surrounding the stadium in the past, a city attorney kind of going through it with a fine-tooth comb and flagging things would be seen as, not just normal, but like commendable. So it just kind of underscores the strangeness of the situation we're in, where we're locked into selling to a public university. Like Kevin Faulconer went to SDSU. This isn't a party that's a private business, and we'd be looking at it a lot differently, I think, if it were. But that said, it is true that she's raised flags from the beginning with the entire scenario, and I don't have a clear sense of, how deep or nuanced the points she's raising are.
Well, let's describe them for a sec. So one of them, like you mentioned, she's been against or had trouble with it for a while. She had fully admits she still thinks Measure G was illegal, that it forced the city to sell the land in a way that was illegal. She tried to push that case. The city council didn't go with her. Fine. So now she's on to this discussion about the actual deal points. I do have an update. They are actually point by point responding to her. So what happened is, after your story ran, they went and met with the mayor, and they said no attorneys allowed, no city attorneys nor SDSU attorneys went there. And they said, here's our answer, and let's figure some of these points out that she made. And then she came out with these 14 points. Most of her points are some version of, we're selling this stadium to you. We want to sell it as is, and we don't want to, get some lawsuit from you in the future. Or this says you're going to have to pay prevailing wages. We don't want them to ever sue the city if you don't. And if you only let university groups use the river park, in a priority fashion, we don't want to get sued if somebody says that's illegal for city property. Those kinds of things are buried into these 14 points. And my understanding is that the university is now going to respond in a written sort of memo, not change their PSA, but a memo sort of putting context on all those points. There's another interesting point that she brought up. She said that normally for affordable housing, the SDSU has agreed to put 10% of the 4,600 housing units aside as affordable housing units and not pay the in lieu food. They were going to actually build them, but they want to manage them through the CSU system as they do for all their affordable housing units across the state. And Elliott made the point that maybe the Housing Commission should do that for the city instead, as all the things done here are. So there's little things like that that are actually a big deal to those agencies. But, are they going to hold up the entire sale? I don't know.
Yeah, they're all fine points, right? Like I don't mean fine as in they're perfectly acceptable. I mean they're finely grained deal points. They're probably not overwhelmingly points that will sway you from one side or the other to thinking this is a good or bad deal or a good or bad use of that land. I think for most people. I don't know if that's fair.
Yeah, and I think this is where the sides being played off themselves really comes in. The city, led by the city staff, as opposed to the city attorney, really wants this deal done. Like they want the money in the bank, and they want to not pay for the stadium anymore. In fact, one of the deal points that's kind of concerning for the city attorney is that they want, if this can't get closed by July, they want San Diego State to renegotiate a better lease for the city where they pay more for the city to operate that stadium. And so, basically, I think at some point this does transition to like, okay, is this a political risk worth taking? Is this a deal I want to do with all these things that my lawyer has told me I may need to worry about? And to the extent like everybody's kind of playing their role at that point. Then the mayor's trying to negotiate a good deal, the city attorney's bringing up things to worry about, and the city council is then going to decide ultimately, whether it's something to sign off on.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Is that like what Maura Elliott is doing in that respect is totally appropriate, but also it would be totally appropriate for the city council to say, "We hear you. Thank you for being a good lawyer. You've informed us, and now it's our turn to make a decision."
So speaking of the crisis, the SDSU and the CSU system got a smoking good deal, it seems like, on financing because of what's happening. They were able to borrow a lot of money at about a 2.9% interest. Here's the deal. They also revealed a lot of how the economics are going to work for this initial effort to prepare the land and to build a stadium. So there's going to be two giant financing efforts. One is $350 million, and that is to prepare the land, to buy the land from the city, to prepare the land for construction, and to get it all ready for this new thing that they're going to build. That's $350 million. And it's going to be structured as interest only. So they're not going to pay any of it off for up to 20 years before they start paying it off, because they want to, at that point, be leasing or selling or whatever opportunities to developers, and then that money can start helping them pay it back. Then the second phase, we've finally got an actual cost of the stadium itself, which is going to be $310 million. And just quoting from that, the source of repayment is going to be the naming rights, concessions, special events at the venue. Maybe if a soccer team comes and rents part of it, they'll pay too. And then the other part is going to be funded by philanthropy. They expect to raise $60 million of charitable giving to pay for the stadium. So, that has increased a lot. We used to talk about $500 million that they need to come up with to get the land ready and to build the stadium. Now it's at $660 million.
Yeah, and it's not unrelated to the pandemic right now, in that it's not at all clear that the city could get the same appraisal for that land right now that it got however many months ago when that appraisal was done. So it's possible that lending some urgency to this is the city's belief that if this deal were to fall apart and they had to go back out and try to put together something comparable, that the land might not be worth as much, because I don't know if you've noticed, but the market conditions have changed in the last couple months.
A little bit. They've been a little shook up. And underneath all of this is just this, of course, is the city's gigantic budget shortfall. It's set right now to bring in about $300 million less than it's set up to spend. And so that difference has to be made up somehow, either through cuts or maybe through new money. And one of the biggest things that has happened is, as broken here on the Voice of San Diego podcast, the $248 million landed in the city's bank account recently from the federal government as part of this relief package that was put together called the CARES Act. Now, with that, though, the federal government said you can't use that money to pay for things that you were already going to pay for, but you can't pay for now because of the crisis in the financial markets and the economy. But you can use it for things that you had to do to protect people or to mobilize for dealing with the coronavirus crisis. Now, that's a really difficult sort of parameter to set. That's a distinction that's going to take a lot of thinking to deal with. And, is that the way to describe what the federal government said, Andy?
Yeah, that's basically the way. I guess another way to say it is you've seen a lot of discussion probably about whether some sort of new phase of coronavirus relief should include direct relief to cities and states. And that conversation sort of echoes the fact that that's not what this money is supposed to be. This money is not supposed to say, well, when economic activity shut down in your areas, you took a huge budget hit because you lost all that revenue, so we're going to give you revenue. That's not what they were trying to do with this. But what they were trying to do was say, well, you've all had to spend money doing all sorts of things that you weren't planning to do, and we're going to cover some of that bill. So, like, from a budgetary perspective, it's a little bit wobbly how big of a distinction that is. But for the purpose of this law, it makes a great deal of difference. And so cities across the country have been trying to figure out just what that means and just what you can use that money for. And the language of the CARES Act itself did not lend very much clarity at all to those questions. So the Treasury had to issue a 4-page memo that answered some of those questions. And then this week they answered a few more in like an FAQ style. And so I talked to an expert at the Tax Foundation. It's a nonprofit group that has been following this closely. And his take was basically that the biggest questions that were unanswered when the act first passed have mostly been answered. And we're down to edge cases at this point. The problem being some of those edge cases are still pretty relevant for, say, the city of San Diego's budget decisions as it decides how to rectify this year's budget, next year's budget, and what the CARES Act money can pay for in either or both of those.
One of the most conservative seeming voices on this that you talked to was Chris Cate, who we're going to talk to later, who suggested, and maybe he was being hyperbolic, but, that the city could get hauled before some, oversight hearing if it spends things the wrong way. And I have to say, I just have a really hard time picturing that happening, so long as the city's not spending money on something egregious and throwing parties with the money. And it really is, maybe funding some of these edge cases, in which case we don't have super clear guidance. I have a hard time picturing, like Katie Porter grilling Chris Cate on the stand of like, how dare you fund 4 lifeguards when you should have, been putting it towards the librarians who, and not just doing this for San Diego, but doing it for every city and entity that got this, enormous amount of money. And so, the extent to which the federal government is going to be going through this with a fine-tooth comb, I have a hard time picturing that. And it's not to say like good for the Chris Cates of the world for doing their due diligence and trying to follow the rules. That's exactly what we should be doing. But it feels a little conservative to me.
There's basically 3 camps that you described in the city council, right? There's the one, Chris Cate, saying like, we got to be ultra cautious, not spend $1 of this that's not clearly because of the COVID mobilization. And there's this other camp Vivian Moreno's leading, it seems like, that says, no, everything that happened after COVID basically counts. you can use this money. Everything changed because of COVID. Thus, everything we spent money on was part of it. And then you have this kind of third camp that seems to be coming up that says like, well, the federal government did say one area that we could use the money on is to give it to businesses as far as like loans and other things. We should be doing a lot of that and figuring out this like perfect, undisputable middle ground that might actually help the community more rather than just close our budget deficit. But there's also at the same time a tremendous pushback going on about closing rec centers, libraries, or cutting back any of the city's services. And so something's got to give. They've got to close this deficit somehow. And if they want to help businesses, they're going to have to come with that money somehow too.
Yeah, and so Councilwoman Monica Montgomery I spoke to, and she said basically these sorts of cuts that we're discussing in the budget right now, we already know that the district that she represents in southeastern San Diego, the district that Vivian Moreno represents, that those communities rely on those neighborhood services more already. And so that any cuts that are enacted are going to fall more harshly on those districts as well. And so to the greatest extent practical, they'd like to use this money to blunt the impact of those cuts. But to your point, yeah, there's like this other question. It's like, well, are there some uses of this money that we would like to explore, such as giving money to businesses or nonprofits as their own sort of coronavirus relief? And Monica Montgomery said she's very interested in that also. So it's not an either or proposition necessarily. The problem is once you start stacking all these things up, $250 million could be spoken for pretty quickly. I mean, there are some cities apparently, based on the expert I spoke to at the Tax Foundation, some cities think that they're probably going to have to leave some of this money unspent. And in comments to a budget committee last week, Vivian Moreno seemed to kind of echo those concerns by saying there is not any excuse at all that we shouldn't spend every dime of this money. Even though I haven't actually heard anyone locally say maybe we shouldn't spend all of this money. There seems to be a broad willingness that we'll spend it all. It's just how do we spend it?
They should be legends and just buy like 4 hotels, or 5 hotels or so.
Well,
somebody's going to. Somebody's going to make the 4 hotel purchase, whether it's San Diego or some other city.
Well, you joke, but there's actually a question that the city is considering these lease to own deals to pick up hotels, and you could actually probably make a good case that those lease payments, as long as the people living in those hotels were people living there because they were displaced by the coronavirus, those lease payments would probably be okay to come out of this CARES Act funding. And so if you, to the extent that those lease payments are part of paying down and eventually buying those hotels, you might be able to. So it's sort of an interesting case, but just to draw a picture of the questions that are facing the city, you mentioned a lifeguard. Like, that's one of the edge cases that I've been using to describe the situation, where if a lifeguard is sitting in a lifeguard chair, primarily keeping their eyes on the water and making sure that everybody is safe, but every once in a while they glance down and tell the people on the beach, hey, make sure you're staying 6 feet from each other, that's probably not something you could pay for out of the CARES Act. But if a lifeguard's shift is going to be walking up and down the beach, ensuring that everyone is following social distancing, then that one probably would be. And so for a city that budgets X amount of dollars for lifeguard services in general every year, it's just a difficult budget situation to unravel. And so the city has actually created these new codes for when employees bill their hours, that there's specific like coronavirus response billing codes.
Well, the city wasn't the only group that got, or the only local agency that got this kind of infusion. The county of San Diego also got $334 million, and about 17 other cities in the region didn't get anything. And so a lot of them are looking at the county and saying like, you got that based on your population, but you actually don't do many of the services for those direct, people that we do. We should get some of that money. Our reporter Ashley McGlone and reporter Lisa Halverstadt did a piece about some of their own problems financially and how they wish to get some of this money. Overall, we didn't get any indication from the county that they're willing to necessarily part with this money, but they also didn't say no, right?
Yeah, they seem to be just now exploring what that would look like and how much they might be willing to give up. There's nothing in the CARES Act that says you can't share the money, but at the same time, it's also not required. And so, they're being lobbied really hard by each of the individual cities, but there's also plenty of things they could use all that money on. And I think at one point, somebody from the county in a hearing recently when they were exploring this option said, we've quickly spent, $200 million of it if we gave everybody what they wanted. And so that money is going to go really quickly if they end up doling it out to individual cities.
Yeah, so the weird way that the money is appropriated from the federal government was based on population at the county level, except if you were a city over 500,000, then you got your population allotment directly. Well, the only city that's that size in San Diego is the city of San Diego. That's why it got that much money. For all of the other people in San Diego County, that money goes to the county government. Now, that becomes complicated because some of those individual cities don't actually rely on the county for certain services because they're not part of the unincorporated county. National City or Chula Vista do have their own, local governments that provide for citizens directly. But at the same time, the county is the chief agency involved in the public health response. So if the county wanted to use that money entirely for their public health response, I would imagine it would be spoken for very quickly, and there would be nothing to provide to these different cities. But if those cities wanted to use some of that money for whatever responses that they have put forward in the last few months, much like the city of San Diego's discussion, well, then they need to ask the county for permission to use it, basically, or to get it, basically.
Well, one city that could certainly use something is Lemon Grove. They were trying to raise the taxes in last election. They did not achieve that. They already were facing basically being dissolved as a city. Now, our Bella Ross checked back in with the city. An official told the city council that the projected year-end deficit increased by $500,000. It's a big deal for that area. And that figure is expected to increase to $1.8 million by the end of the following fiscal year. Basically, they said within 2 years they could be out of money.
Well, but that was, that vote to increase taxes, that failed, 2-3 years ago? 4 years ago?
No, I thought it was in...
No, it was in March.
Oh, that was 40 days ago. Oh, it just feels like...
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
I see what you did there. Yeah, and at the time they were trying to get voters to pass the tax increase. They said things are so dire that we could have only a fraction of our reserves within 5 years. And now, just 40 days or however long it's been later, they're saying, no, in 2 years, it will be gone.
Yeah.
All right, well... going to be very interesting to watch how all these things get hashed out by the city councils and county supervisors in the next little while. Again, we're going to be talking to Cate about that. One of the things that I've been talking about and he's been focused on for the years has been childcare. And I was being patient with the system for a while as we were, I wanted to make sure we had access to get outside and stuff like that. But as the talk about reopening the economy really ramped up, I started to get alarmed that we were really marching towards sending people back to work, and yet schools and summer camps just are not anywhere close to opening. And so I wrote a piece this week about the mayor, of course, and County Supervisor Greg Cox put out a recover strategy for how San Diego businesses could get together and open things up. And, it was a list of strategies, had a lot of important recommendations about cleanliness, and you got to disinfect the break room, and you got to keep, if you're walking into a restaurant, you got to make sure people walk in one way and then walk out the other way so they don't cross. But there was nothing about schools or daycares or plans for summer camp. And I just don't think, he said, we're ready to recover. And I just don't think we are ready to recover until, there's a plan for opening schools. And there are so many interesting things that could come up with this. If they don't have a plan to, open schools in, a normal way, or a way that you can send your kids by, like, say, September, it could be a long time before the workforce is even ready to get anything close back to the way they were about working before this crisis.
I think one important point here that you brought up is that it's not just that, how does a business function if its workers don't have childcare, which is a big concern, but also if we've somehow determined that it's not safe or appropriate for kids to be in daycare or at summer camp, then why is it safe or appropriate for adults who are presumably more vulnerable to the virus? And so that's a big disconnect that nobody seems to be talking about.
Yeah, and if you were able to figure out how it could be safe to go back to school, a physical space, that would actually inform the other things you could do pretty well as well. Like you would have established the bare minimum of or maybe the ideal sort of way to handle living with this threat, and that could inform how restaurants and other things could get. My basic point is, like, I can be patient, but if you start to say we're ready to get going, to fire things up, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be told or asked to go to a physical place of business and won't have access to childcare, or maybe there's some, spotty things opening up that they don't know if they can trust to send their kids to, because we don't have this sort of collective discussion about what is allowed or not.
Yeah, to me, it's part of this comes down to, like, expectations and what are we actually announcing here? What is the actual message? Because to your broader point, and I think the most important point is the big picture idea of returning to normal, or bringing the economy back, or getting back to work. Like, your fundamental point that cannot happen until working people who have kids have a place for those kids to go during the day. That seems true enough to me. Now, I don't know that means that, well, that doesn't seem true enough. That seems inarguable. That there is nothing resembling normalcy until there's somewhere for kids to go and be safe when they're there. In the meantime, it may be perfectly reasonable to open up some things. If we can, if some bars and restaurants and spas and golf clubs and whatever else can open up with limited hours or with new rules or whatever, it doesn't seem to me that we have to wait until September or October when schools are open to do those things if we think there's a safe path to doing it now. But that just means, in the meantime, what are your expectations? Is it reasonable to tell people we're open for business, San Diego's ready to go, if really these are kind of just marginal changes in what you could do on a day-to-day basis? Because it really doesn't matter what bars or restaurants or spas or massage parlors open up. Like, my life will not go back to normal until there's somewhere that I can send my kid. That's not a hypothetical. That's not me, like, having a take. I can just tell you, in my own personal life, until my son can go somewhere for 8 hours during the day, I'm here in this house. Period. End of story. It's almost just a question of what other amenities are available to me during that time. But I think the point that you got to just before I started speaking to is, what about the people who work at those things? What do they do with their kids if they're going to be expected to go back to work?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of passion around that one. My wife actually tweeted the link, but she never supports actually promoting my work. So that was pretty thrilling. All right, we're we're going to take a quick break. On the other side, we'll hear from San Diego City Councilman Cate. Stay with us.
I'm Adriana Heldes, and I'm a producer at Voice of San Diego. When I started working here at Voice, and whenever we hire a new reporter, we get a debrief of the entire region. It's a quick but useful explanation of some stuff most people in San Diego don't know about. Our CEO, Scott Lewis, walks us through things we need to know in order to follow all the in-depth reporting Voice of San Diego does, like how San Diego gets its water, how local government works, why there are different types of schools, and who decides major things that affects us as San Diegans. These things help us understand the bigger picture and the drama that's happening in San Diego every day. And then we realized that everyone else should know this stuff too. So we started a project called San Diego 101. It's a video series that explains it all. Our videos will help you understand how our region works, and you can watch all 5 episodes now at vosd.org/SD101. Again, that's vosd.org/SD101.
In the virtual Voice of San Diego podcast studio, Councilman Cate, who I can see in his virtual studio, is located on Reagan Road, based on the street sign behind him. Councilman, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. What did you come by that Reagan Road sign in a lawfully validated procedure? What's the story on that?
I actually did. I did. So a few years back, we were able to change the street name of Reagan Road on the portion that is next to Mira Mesa High School. Mm-hmm. And so we changed that lawfully to Marauder Way. And these are this is one of the leftover signs that was just going to be thrown away. And so decided to keep that. And, no doubt I'm a Republican and, very, very supportive of Mr. Reagan and a fan of Mr. Reagan. So had to keep it for part of my memorabilia.
Got it. All right. So speaking of being a proud Republican, in the last couple of weeks, there has emerged what seems to me to be a pretty clear partisan split on their views of what the appropriate way to handle coming out of this lockdown period is. There seems to be far more of an outspoken belief that it's time to get back to work and open things up to the greatest extent practical, coming from the right. Councilman, your colleague, Councilman Scott Sherman, has put together a group involving some other mayors. Jim Desmond at the county has been part of that. Coronado Mayor Richard Bailey as well. And you also, I think, expressed some frustration with Governor Gavin Newsom about I guess it was a week ago, maybe it was 2 weeks ago now, about the beach closures. Where do you stand on this question right now about where we should be, what's appropriate, and what needs to change?
I think from my standpoint, the biggest issue I had and I have is what are the goals and metrics that we're trying to obtain that leads to certain decisions to be made about getting back to some semblance of normalcy. When we first started this out, it was about flattening the curve and not overrunning our hospital system with our ventilators, ICU beds, and the like. And I get that. I think we all agreed to that, and we were bound to that. We, for the most part, stayed indoors. We tried to do what we could. But since that time, where I think we've been able to accomplish that, it seems like things are changing and new goals are being set, which is fine, but there's no, okay, if we get there, this is what we can expect to happen. And going into 7 weeks of this now, with 30 million Americans unemployed, with 27% unemployment rate in the county based on the latest SANDAG projections, that is how it had and has a huge impact on everybody in San Diego. And I think what we're looking for is, where do we go from here and what can we expect moving forward? Now hearing what the governor's talking about, even just as of the recording today, about potentially opening restaurants now. I mean, that's great. We should be going to that. But I think the frustration part that for me was, what do we get when we accomplish certain goals? And that was really just, I think, for a lot of San Diegans, we're goal oriented and goal setting, and we want to hit those targets. And what do we get for doing that?
We've been tracking quite a bit at Voice on how many tests the county is doing and how that measures up to their capacity, and then how that capacity compares to what we've sort of previously said is the number that we need to, feel safe, that we have our arms wrapped around the spread of the pandemic, and that we can start behaving a little bit, emerging from the lockdown safely. If it's not testing that's holding us back, what is your sense of what may be the thing holding us back? My understanding is that it had been testing, but if that's not it, what is the thing that we need to overcome, do you think?
That's a great question. And, I don't mean to be, I'm not trying to be political on this. I'm not trying to be, a naysayer or I don't know what the word is, but, I honestly think as part of it is politics and not knowing what's going to happen, and for elected officials, that's very difficult, and not wanting to take blame if something were to happen. But, the one thing that I've been trying to, when I talk about this, to tell people is that there are trade-offs with any decision that you make on any policy, on anything we do every single day as policymakers. There are trade-offs. If we are in a perpetual state of lockdown, let's say past summer into September, that comes at the expense of something. If we open today, whether it's partially or just, a wide open, there's an impact to that as well too. There is an effect to that as well too. And so, that's where I think it's, a lot of folks are maybe trying to thread the needle and be kind of on both sides, because the fear of the unknown and what could happen. So I think that is part of it, and what's driving a lot of people, because the one thing, again, I don't hear is, what goes into the evaluation of why we're now pushing away from of being in lockdown, now opening businesses earlier than we had really just expected, which I'm supportive of. But what drove that decision? And I'm not hearing that, and maybe that's being communicated, but no one's saying, because we're able to do these things, and we have now gone to this place. I'm not hearing that. Yeah.
So the one of the other reasons we wanted to have you on is because you have since in the time since you've become a father, and you recently became a father twice over. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
And so you've sort of started to dip your toes into the policy arena around childcare and how important that is for working people. And that has, to some extent, been a missing piece of the latest part of the Open Up Caucus, as far as I can tell. And to put a really fine point on it, you could open up everything tomorrow, but working parents can't go back to work unless they have somewhere for their kids to go during the day. And so, as somebody who has started to take an interest in this from a policy perspective, and as somebody who is in that very situation, what is your understanding of where questions around daycare, summer camps, schools opening fit? And if those things aren't being answered, is it even possible to talk about going back to work? Is that even something that we can entertain, or that these task force that are putting out these recommendations can even make any difference on until that other question is settled?
No, it's a great point, and it's something where it needs to be considered. And if Scott were here, I would tell him I agreed with his editorial about having that be part of the discussion, whether it's childcare or schools, and being part of that, having that part of the conversation about opening up. For me, luckily, my daycare is open. I'm considered an essential worker, and so my 2-year-old daughter is currently in daycare, and my provider provides for other essential workers as well too. But as kind of the gates start opening up for different workers to go start their businesses again or go back to work, there needs to be that conversation with providers about space and where do these people go for their kids. We sent a letter, myself and Councilmember Ward and Councilmember Montgomery sent a letter to the county about allocating $5 million of CARES Act funding to provide childcare for essential workers. One thing we learned in talking with the YMCA about space is that there was space to have children of essential workers go to these different providers. The issue became funding. And so as we start opening the gates and getting back to some semblance of normalcy, I think we need to take advantage of that open space to figure out how can we have kids go to these different areas. And then we need to have a separate conversation once we're somewhat back to normal, because we were impacted and there weren't enough slots for all of the people who had that need. But until we get to that point, I think we need to take advantage of what's available to us and figure out how we can align folks to what they need. The one thing that I found somewhat comical is, I think about a few weeks ago, the governor had a press conference and mentioned that, well, for childcare, they're going to have to practice social distancing when they get back to normal. And, you're a father too, Andy. Please tell me how you would like to have kids socially distance in either a school or a childcare facility. It's not going to happen. And so I think there needs to be that conversation. Do we talk about, cleaning? Perfect. Okay, we can have that conversation about making sure there's cleanliness, who comes into the childcare facility in terms of workers and whatnot. Those are things that I think are reasonable, but having kids socially distance is not going to happen.
Yeah. Do you think the lack of childcare, and I mean, by all accounts, unless something changes in by the standards of government, a really miraculous way, public schools will not be open until September at the earliest. Is that seems fair to say, right?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Okay.
So that being the case, do you think there's been enough attention paid to this matter from the folks who have predominantly come from your party, but not exclusively, people who are saying, hey, let's get some urgency. Let's open things back up again. I mean, how much of a difference can you have opening things up again if schools aren't taken care of? And so if that's true, doesn't it kind of talk past the problem? Doesn't it I want everything to be back to normal too, but as long as this one thing is back to normal, we're not back to normal.
No, it's a great question. I think, I know the schools conversation is happening. We have different elected bodies who do that, whether you're the County Board of Education or the school district. I know those conversations have to be happening. And one thing too is, there are some schools that are, aren't on traditional calendars. They are on year-round schools. So how do they fold in the mix as well too? But I think the one difference between childcare and schools is, you have a lot of other interest when you're talking about schools as opposed to childcare. A lot of other people who have advocates and lobbyists and other representatives who are who want to be part of the conversation. That may be a lot more difficult to come to some reasonable solution. Let's talk about traditional schools who would be on summer. Do you count what we have just gone through maybe as part of their summer, and go back earlier? What does that look like? Or do you switch to more of a year-round model for maybe the next year and then go back to traditional because of what you've missed? I'm not a part of those conversations. I don't know how nimble folks can be when it comes to that. But, that's where those conversations have to be included with the policymakers on how you get to that. They may be happening. I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but they have to be, I think, open to explaining that as part of the overall strategy of getting back to normal.
So the other thing we wanted to talk about was the CARES Act funding that has come into the city of San Diego's possession. $248 million, along with some indications about how that money can be used and how it should not be used. We went over this in the first part of the show. So let me ask this way. Since that money has arrived, have you gotten more clarity? Are you getting to the point that you feel like questions have been answered about how the city can spend that money?
I'm starting to, and every day it's a little bit more. And we've had conversations with the mayor's, the government affairs team for the city, and their conversations with the feds about what that money can and can't be used for. And we have some our own contacts in Washington, and so hearing from them as well too. And I think the one big piece of this, and I think can't be lost on either policymakers or the public, is that that money cannot be used to backfill loss of revenues. That's a huge thing, because I think people can have the perception that we'll take, our deficit is $250 million. We just got $250 million in our bank, just, transfer it over. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work that way. And so one thing that it was interesting is that Rick Gentry with the Housing Commission commented when they presented the Housing Commission budget. I thought he put it great, is that usually when there is federal money being dispersed out, the audit comes soon after. And so that's where, for me, I want to make sure we're abundantly clear and have everything in place, from dotting our I's and crossing our T's before we spend that money, that it's being used in a manner that will not look poorly upon us by the federal government when that audit does come.
Yeah, so I guess if you look at just the things that I would imagine you have some bit of confidence in saying are eligible expenditures. For instance, the most recent guidance from the Treasury says that, like, public safety response, you can really safely presume that that's going to be covered. So police officers who are working a beat and making sure that businesses that are supposed to be closed because of the shutdown are closed, or that are going through lines outside grocery stores to make sure that people are social distancing, or making sure parks are closed, or whatever else they might be doing, that all of that is going to basically be okay. If you tally up all of those things that you have a high degree of confidence in between March and December, do you think it's going to be hard to get to $248 million? You know what I mean?
I think it will be. No, I absolutely think it will be. And
you think it'll be hard to spend all of the money?
I do.
Really?
Especially when you look at the guidance about, it can't be over and above or it has to be used for positions or work over and above what was already budgeted in our current fiscal year. We couldn't use that money to pay for our police officer who we already had on staff. But if they were using overtime to do patrols or do something COVID related, we can count that time. It's just a matter of tracking that time and figuring what that expense is. But when you have 1,900 police officers, all 1,900 police officers aren't doing something that's COVID related. So it's not going to pay for our entire police department budget. So I think it will be difficult. There is some wiggle room there. And that's where, I would like to have a greater conversation with, the mayor's office and staff, is that, we could use money to provide the grants and loans we had for our small business relief program. Could we, let's say we spent $150 million that we could arguably say this was COVID related in expenses, and we were able to spend 150 of the $250 million that we got. Could we take the remaining $100 million and say we want to give small business relief grants to our businesses? And that way we make up the balance of what's left out there. I don't know the answer to that question. My gut tells me we probably can't do that, but could we take a large chunk of that and give that as grants and loans to small businesses? Those are some of the questions that I have that, I've just being in government for some time, you kind of have a feeling of what you can and can't do, but trying to get some definitive answers is something that I'm going to want to get before I approve a budget and approve those expenditures.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so the mayor's office is due when it has its May revise for the budget cycle. It's going to issue an updated picture on the current fiscal year, on the fiscal budget that you at the city council are working towards right now for July, and also trying to put together a report to answer some of these questions about the CARES Act funding. So it sounds, from what I'm hearing to you, like you don't think that the severe budget cuts that have already been presented to the city, you don't really think that this CARES Act is going to alleviate very much in the way of those cuts.
Not at all. Not at all. And I think it would be somewhat foolish to think that we're going to be able to mitigate any cuts by using the CARES Act. I mean, the cuts that we're talking about are real, they're severe, and we really don't know the extent of it. I mean, we're going to be guessing up until we get into the late summer, early fall, maybe toward the end of the calendar year on where we're going to be. Right now, as it stands with the mayor's current budget, not the May revise, we were estimating that conventions were going to kick off again and start again in August. That's probably not going to happen, and we're probably not going to have any conventions between at least early fall, maybe towards the end of the calendar year. I mean, we really don't know. But if so, that's going to have a huge impact on our sales tax revenue, our tourist tax revenue, and we won't know what that impact's going to be. So I can see us being in a position where we're going to have to play this quarter by quarter and see what we're going to do. I mean, even the 2 weeks after the mayor's proposed budget came out, he said that we're going to be short another $50 million. So that 250 went to 300. It's been another couple of weeks, probably be 3 to 4 weeks before the May revise comes out. What's going to happen in that interim as well too? So it's real. The cuts we're talking about are real, and that's where, at least from my standpoint, as a policymaker and as the legislative branch that controls the purse, we need to start talking about what are real core city services that residents cannot live without. What are the nice to haves? What's the icing on the cake that we can remove and push off until we get back to normal, hopefully next fiscal year, but probably in all realistic fashion, the next couple of fiscal years.
Boy, that's a rosy picture you paint there.
Sorry to be the bearer of bad news and to be a party pooper.
All right, well, we'll leave it at that. We'll keep our eyes peeled for the mayor's office's report on how some of that CARES Act money will be spent and how the most up-to-date budget picture looks in a couple weeks when that comes forward. In the meantime, enjoy the this maternity leave period.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy. Thanks for having me on.
All right, later, Councilman.
Thanks for listening to the Voice of San Diego podcast. It's the most popular public affairs podcast recorded in my kitchen and Andy's bedroom and Sarah's. Is that a bedroom? Yeah. Get the politics report every week. Andy and I put that together. It covers a lot of stuff we talk about here and more. Subscribe at vosd.org/politics. And one last thing, we will be hosting a live stream next Wednesday night. It's dedicated to distance learning and our investigation into school sexual misconduct. We'll have District Attorney Summer Stephan and other great panelists talk to our reporters. Ashley McGlone, Kayla Jimenez have put this together to talk about this new era. Like we covered a lot about how teachers and students interact, sometimes very inappropriately. And so what does this mean now that everybody's on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Zoom, all these places? So a lot to talk about there. Very interesting program they put together. So follow us on your favorite social media app to catch that. It's going to be on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube Wednesday at 5 p.m. I'm Scott Lewis, the CEO and editor-in-chief. Andrew Keats is assistant editor. Sarah Libby's managing editor. And this show is produced by Nate John. Thanks for listening. We will talk to you next week.